Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always my privilege to be recognized to address you here on the floor of the House of Representatives, and I find it a bit ironic that I'm watching the representatives from Florida, New York, and Texas speak to the Speaker pro tem just previous to you about the election situation. I'm thinking about the 2000 election when it was reported, not substantiated to my satisfaction, but reported that as many as 25,000 people from New York voted both in New York and in Florida either for a president from Texas or one from Tennessee, where the Speaker pro tem momentarily ago was from. That's a bit of an irony as I listen to this discussion that's going on about the election process here in the United States. And I think there's too little concern on the part of my colleagues, whom I do respect and appreciate and count as friends in many respects. I think there's too much focus on how you get more warm bodies to the polls as many times as possible and not enough on the legitimate vote. Now, as I listen, the gentleman from Texas said there's no demonstrable evidence that fraud is occurring. I would disagree. I think convictions are demonstrable evidence. And the convictions, particularly in Troy, New York, of election fraud, I have seen it in the state of Iowa in a fashion that didn't result in convictions, but I have conviction that it happened. We have paid too little attention to election fraud. And in the case that I mentioned of people voting in the state of New York and in the state of Florida, if they do both, they surely can't be lawfully voting in each of the states. They may not be lawfully able to vote in either state, but voting in both states. And how does that happen, Mr. Speaker? This is an unexamined subject matter on the part of my colleagues from the other side of the aisle. How does it happen that people can vote someplace where they don't reside? How does it happen that people can vote when they're not citizens? How does it happen that they can vote when they're not qualified to vote? And how does it happen that they can vote in more than one jurisdiction for the same election, not necessarily simultaneously, but possibly simultaneously? And I can tell you, to answer those questions to some degree, how that is, Mr. Speaker. It works this way. The voter registration lists within the states are not integrated among the states. And so if an individual is registered to vote in New York, they can also be registered to vote in Florida, or any adjoining state for that matter, New Jersey, Connecticut, you name it. All they have to do is go in and register in one state and go register in the other state. In fact, in my own state, it was the case, and probably is not still the case, that the voter registration list does not integrate itself county to county in a definitive way. If John Doe registers to vote in Washington County and goes over to register to vote as John M. Doe in Jefferson County, there's two registrations there, and John Doe can vote in both counties, both by absentee. In fact, in my state, where it's 99 counties, it's possible to vote in 99 counties simultaneously by absentee. If you just simply register yourself to vote, put up an address that is perhaps a false address, but an address of someone else, and if that address is, if the voter registration is unique in any way, if it's the initial could change, it could be John, it could be Jonathan, it could be the middle name can change, and that's all it would take. The same person could vote multiple times in a state. Now think how many times that can happen when they're crossing the state lines. No one has yet calculated how many times an individual could vote in the United States if they really wanted to game the system. And we do hear credible stories of buses taking people across the state lines, and buses taking people from precinct to precinct to vote multiple times. And who have been the advocates for same-day registration? Who have been the advocates for lowering the integrity of the vote itself? It's been the people on the other side of the aisle. It's been the Democrats. The things that Republicans bring to establish credibility and integrity in the vote are undermined by the Democrats on the other side of the aisle, Mr. Speaker. And why? Because they say that people are disenfranchised from their vote. And I would argue that legitimate voters, American citizens who respect the law and vote one time, one place in their legal residence, are watching their vote be canceled out by illegitimate votes that happen in this country. Because we don't have convictions for people voting in multiple locations for the same election, isn't it an indication that it doesn't happen? We do have some convictions. We don't have large numbers of convictions, as the gentleman from Texas may have implied, but not specifically said. The reason for that is because our voting laws are so open, so lax, so insecure that it's nearly impossible to get a conviction. For example, in the state of New Mexico, if I were working the voting booths as an election worker in New Mexico, and I open the polls up at, say, 8 o'clock in the morning, and I'm sitting there for the list of people that come in and they say, I'm John Doe, I'm Jane Doe, I'm Jim Smith. If one of them walks in and says, I'm Steve King and I live at the address where I live and I've not yet voted, I am compelled, even as an election worker, to let that false and fraudulent individual vote under my name. It's against the law in New Mexico and other states to challenge an illegitimate voter even when you know that they're illegitimate, even to the extent that they allege they are the person who is checking them off the list. They still have to let them vote and they can't challenge them. That's how open these laws are. That's the kind of thing that you have promoted, the kind of thing that you won't defend, the kind of thing that I will yield to if you've got a defense for opening up and eroding the integrity of the vote in the United States. And many of these are state laws, I recognize that. But we give direction and leadership. We have the HAVA Act, the Help America Vote Act, that open it up even more. And I think the gentleman from New York who spoke within the last half hour, and I do agree on this, there should be a paper trail so we can audit the votes that are cast. Now, we've agreed on that. We've worked together on that cause, not arrived at that as far as the conclusion for this Congress is concerned that can be passed into law, but I think there should be a paper trail, and the gentleman from New York and I are in conceptual agreement on that, Mr. Holt. And I appreciate that push. I do think it's out of the right spirit of his head and his heart, but it might also be from suspicion that the people that produce the electronic voting machines may be Republicans, they may be Democrats, and that seems to color our judgment. Mine is, don't give anybody a chance to cheat, and don't let the electronic voting machines be offered in such a way that some programmer can jigger the machine to give an advantage to either party. I think of the election situation that took place in Florida in the year 2000. I spent 37 days focusing on that. I was the chairman of the Iowa State Senate State Government Committee. It was my job to see to it that Iowa didn't become a Florida for the fiasco in Florida. So therefore, I chased through all the way through the internet, everything that I could find, all the research that I could come up with on the election processes state by state. 37 days of focus. And then after that, not quite as focused, but I followed through and wrote legislation which passed the Iowa Senate. And I discovered a significant amount of election fraud in this country. This is in the year 2000, well before the American public had heard of ACORN. I found, I believed, a significant amount of election fraud. There were a pair of brothers in Florida that had done research on election fraud in Florida, the Collier brothers. Both of them now passed away. They've written a book on this and did a video on it, as I recall. And part of that video was walking into the maintenance shop where they took care of the machines that counted the punch card ballots, the notorious punch card ballots that were prevalent in Florida in the year 2000. And they have the video of the former election commissioner who had retired from that and handed it over, of course, to his successor and gone to work maintaining the vote counting machines. The machines that you would feed in a stack of punch card ballots and it would run through and the machine would read it and it'd spit the number out the other side. And on that video, and it was available at the time, I don't know if it's available now, a man walked through his shop and pulled out of the drawer a gear. And he said, here's how we do this. We just grind one tooth off of this gear, and then every time 10 ballots go through, it kicks an extra one in our side. On videotape, there it was. And, of course, they got nervous afterwards and tried to do what they could to suppress it. Those kind of things have gone on in America. They have gone on in Florida. They've gone on in other states. And the people that advocate for or defend more open election laws and process are, whether they realize it or not, enabling election fraud in this country. I want it to be as clean as possible, as legitimate as possible. I don't want a single qualified vote to be canceled out by an unqualified vote, let alone one that's designed to be fraudulent. I don't want buses going across state lines loaded with people that are in there to do same-day registration to vote and disappear. We had voters in Iowa that registered from the hotel room where the campaign had out-of-state workers. People don't live in hotels in these kind of neighborhoods. It may happen in the inner city. It doesn't happen in a hotel in the neighborhoods I'm talking about in Iowa. These are people that come and stay a couple days, or 4 or 5 days, maybe a week, and they're gone again. These are folks that have a home of their own. It isn't a residence. When you register to vote from a hotel where they didn't have a single guest that stayed longer than 2 weeks in the last year, you're pretty sure that if that's the hotel where they put their campaign workers that came from out of state, it's a pretty good bet that those votes that were registered in that hotel are votes from people that are not legitimate to vote within that precinct, within that district, or probably, and almost in each of those cases, within the state. So I have advocated, let's see, here's another, the statement made by the gentleman from Texas, if you have no Texas driver's license, you have to get someone to take you to the polls. Well, is that person a recluse? Don't they have an opportunity for an absentee ballot? Do they ever go to town, for example? And if they do, can't they time their trip to the grocery store to go in on election day and vote? And the concern about the primary part of this, yes, I think there are some fraudulent primaries that take place. And there are some that are stacked up that I'd like to see them revisit. I'd like to see the Granite State revisit their primary process, that it lets people go to the polls and vote, and they say the Democrats go to the polls and vote in the Republican primary. We in Iowa have a caucus system for our president, and there we require that they be registered either as Democrats or Republicans. They have to pick one or the other, and they don't get to switch sides that easily, although it is possible in the state of Iowa. But here's what needs to happen in this country. We need to have voter registration lists that are free of duplicates, free of deceased, and free of felons where the law applies. And they need to be certified to be citizens, not a motor voter law that people go in that don't speak English, that get their driver's license, and then they ask them a question, check this box, check that box. If they don't understand English, they don't know what they're saying yes to. They don't realize that they are under penalty of perjury if they claim to be a citizen and they are not. And so they will say yes, they get the nod, now they're registered to vote. Now a non-citizen, quite often illegal, is in a position to cast a ballot. And we saw 537 votes be the difference in the state of Florida in the year 2000 on who would be the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, and the leader of the free world, decided by 537 votes in the state of Florida. Now, every time they've recounted those votes in Florida, I think that Republicans on this side and Democrats on this side will agree that it came back to that same number. And if you've got some other narrative, again, I'll yield to you. You can tell me what your narrative is. But the consensus now, after all this analysis, is we got a legitimate vote there. George Bush was not the appointed president. He was the elected president. But it was very, very close in the year 2000. And it did pivot on Florida. But how far apart would that election have been if one could actually know which of the votes were fraudulent and which were not? Last time I came to the floor, I heard the whip, or the minority whip, come to the floor and make the statement that we didn't have evidence, again, as we've heard from the gentleman from Texas, no demonstrable evidence that fraud is occurring. And the gentleman from Maryland's statement was close to that, although not exact. I'd argue the opposite. We have Acorn that admitted to more than 400,000 fraudulent voter registrations. More than 400,000 confessed to fraudulent registrations. This is the Acorn that I carry in my pocket, Mr. Speaker. I carry it in my pocket every day to remind me of what happens to this country if we let organizations like Acorn or advocates that seek to diminish the integrity of the vote take over. If they do that, then they erode the faith in the American people in the election. You can have fraudulent elections, but as long as we believe that they're legitimate, American people are going to accept the results. Because we do have great faith in this constitutional republic, which is guaranteed to us in Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, by the way, shall guarantee a republican form of government. But this country respects the election process, and that's why we accept the results of the election process. And if we lose faith in it, in the election process, legitimate or not, then the very bedrock that the foundation of our country, the Constitution, sets on, crumbles. And the Constitution itself crumbles, and we crumble into some form of anarchy because we will have lost our integrity in our election process. Now, is it too much to ask that if someone goes to the polls, that they would bring with them a picture ID? I wonder if any of those folks have ever gotten on an airplane, or if they've ever gone to rent a movie, and they're asked for an identification to support their credit card when they rent a movie. That's not too much to ask. I've never heard anyone come to this Congress and say, I demand my civil liberties. I demand that I be able to rent a movie without any identification, without any credit card. Why can't we just do that on my word? I'll walk in and sign this paper that says, I'm Joe Blow, and I live at 100 Exotic Avenue, and I want to rent an exotic movie, and I don't want to have an identification to do that. Never had anybody ask for that in this Congress. They know they don't have a civil right to do business in this country without identification. If the merchant requires that identification, they willingly supply it. And yet, to choose the next leader in the free world, the commander-in-chief, the president of the United States, the advocates that have stood on the floor have said to the effect of, anybody that walk up there and attest that they are a living, breathing human being and that they live somewhere, they can vote. And they can register on the spot, and they can vote, and they can walk away not showing any identification whatsoever. And in some cases, it just takes someone to attest to that they are the individual that they say they are. So they don't really even need to misrepresent themselves. They can walk up and say, I'm Joe Blow, I want to vote here, and I live in this precinct. They sometimes will lie about where they live, but they can actually say who they are. Then they can walk to the next precinct and say, I'm Joe M. Blow. And then I'm Joe N. Blow at the next precinct, and O. Blow, and P, Q, R, right on down the line. They can put a number in for their middle name, vote in 99 counties in the state of Iowa, and they can do it in many of the other states as well. We do not have the integrity in our election process that we need. I know that it's being gamed. I also know that we're not getting the convictions and the prosecutions because we don't have the structure in place even to get those convictions, because we've eroded the integrity to the point where there's not a basis there hardly to bring that kind of a prosecution. And then we watched George Soros invest in the campaigns of multiple secretaries of state across the country. And where was it? Swing states. And what happened in those close elections where George Soros was a campaign contributor? We know what happened. Those real close elections, in the last minute, votes showed up that were surprises, and the election turned. We have at least one senator down the aisle at my neighborhood that arrived in that fashion, Mr. Speaker. And so I am disturbed about the results of these elections if they do not reflect the actual will of the American people, the actual will of the people within the jurisdiction that should be voting for those candidates. And I believe we need to enhance the integrity of the ballot. I would shorten the terms that a person could be asking for an absentee ballot, and I would tighten the conditions, and so that if it's reasonable for you to vote in person on election day, do so. These elections should not be a drawn-out 45 or 90-day absentee ballot affair. The more we do the absentee ballots, the more we cast our ballots from afar, the more likely it is we're voting for a candidate who's passed away during the campaign. And the less likely it is we will know all the things we need to know to make a reasoned judgment about that candidate. In fact, it's possible we have elected a United States Senator who had passed away in a tragic plane accident. And I regret that happened, but the people went to the polls and voted to elect that person who was passed away. I'm for a voter registration system that's free of duplicates, deceased, and where the law applies felons. I'm for a picture ID, a government-issued picture ID that has legitimacy. And I'm opposed to motor voter. I'm opposed to satellite voting. And I'm opposed to same-day registration. And all of these components of the election process, I add to that again, there needs to be a paper trail for the ballots. Let's have integrity. Let's have a certification that they be citizens from the secretaries of state of each of the states. And then, if we don't have enough integrity in our ballots, something's got to happen where we crunch the databases of the voter registration against those of the other states to find out how many duplicates there really are. And there would be many. So I have less faith in this than most of the American public does, and if they had the exposure to what I've had the exposure to, I would submit, Mr. Speaker, that there wouldn't be the confidence in this election process that the American public has, and that lack of confidence might result in a different kind of a result here within this Congress and within the states. I think that they would impose more integrity in the ballot process. And so I didn't come here to speak about that. I listened to the gentlelady and the gentleman that spoke in the previous period, and I felt that I had to express the other viewpoint. I actually came here, Mr. Speaker, to talk about how we transform this economy here in the United States. And being from Iowa, I've listened to the economic proposals of each of the presidential candidates. I've listened to them make their pitch for their vision for America. And I said last January, February, March, and on throughout the summer, clear into August at least, that we don't have a presidential candidate on the Republican side of the aisle that's put together an economic recovery plan. Yes, they have pieces, yes, they have components, and they do tweak it around the edges, and they'll argue that one piece or another is what it takes to bring our economy back around where it belongs. Well, I've watched this economy devolve downward, and it's a deep trough, but worse than the deep trough is the length of this trough that we're in. And it is an economic fact that if you look at the patterns of economic growth and decline throughout the history of the free market world, one will see that whenever there has been a Keynesian economic theory applied, the more vigor with which it is applied, the longer is the trough for recovery. If one were to look at the grandest experiment of Keynesian economics we had seen up till this point, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal that he unleashed on the American people starting at the beginning of his term. Stock market crash in October of 1929, and we saw Herbert Hoover caught up in the throes of that climactic shift economically that was a global trend. Herbert Hoover had everything he'd touched had turned to gold up to that point. He believed that he could steer government to solve the problem. Well, he went to work to try to steer government, and it went the other way on him. Cool Cal Coolidge had a pretty good handle on it earlier in the previous decade, and that was set back, not just, let's see, how did it go? Don't just stand there, do nothing, and because the free market system will recover itself. Well, instead, we had Smoot-Hawley, we had trade protectionism, we had then the New Deal that flowed out of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We had billions of dollars that ultimately were spent throughout that period of time, at least in today's dollars. And the CCC camps, the WPA programs, the TVA, the list went on and on and on that came out of Roosevelt. Throw another plan at it, throw some more money at it, borrow some money, grow the federal government, and put money into the hands of people. And if you do that, the theory was, according to John Maynard Keynes, who was the most influential economist of his time, and his curse lingers on us in this Congress today, that if you would get money in the hands of people, they would spend it, and that would stimulate the economy, and the economy would recover. In other words, we could spend ourselves into prosperity, according to John Maynard Keynes. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt bought into the Keynesian economic theory with more vigor than George W. Bush bought into the Henry Paulson stimulus plan, or should I say the TARP plan. $700 billion tossed in there to pick up toxic debt was the plan. But back in the 30s, it was FDR's plan to follow Keynes's directive, which was put money into the hands of people and get them to spend it, and you'll stimulate the economy. Because they believed that our economy was consumer-driven. Well, Mr. Speaker, every Keynesian experiment that I know of in history, and that includes Roosevelt's New Deal, it includes the Japanese, and it absolutely includes Barack Obama's economic stimulus plans, his approach to this. And by the way, President Obama has told us directly face-to-face that he believes that Roosevelt lost his nerve, that he should have spent a lot more money in the 30s, that because he lost his nerve and didn't spend more, it brought about a recession, a recession within a depression, and unemployment went up because Roosevelt didn't borrow and spend enough government money. Well, I know what it's like to compete with a government that has more money than the private sector has. I know what it's like to try to hire somebody off of unemployment. I know what it's like to train employees, put them on a benefits plan, and have them finally in a place where they can be a full-time employee that can yield a return on the work that they're doing, and you can count on them being to work every day and look at how their career is laid out working for your company, and have the federal government or the state government or the county government or even the city government come in and outbid you for those services. And how do they do that? Well, they do that by looking around and thinking, here's this trained employee, what's it take to get them? And they will up the ante until they can hire this trained employee, and inevitably that employee will take the offer of the higher paycheck and a benefits package that competes or exceeds the one that you can offer from the private sector and go to work for the government, where they don't have the responsibility, where they don't have to work as hard, where the hours are more predictable, where the risk of employment is less and it's more stable. I recognize that. But better wages and better benefits and all of those comforts that come with a government job work against the private sector. And so private sector employers then find themselves faced with having to go out and hire more help and train more help and see that those employees roll over into the government employment. Now here's the real downside, though, is this. Where does the government come up with the money to pay more wages and pay better benefits, which they have been increasingly doing over the last generation? By raising taxes. The government raises taxes to get the revenue to bid against the private sector. And then the government comes out and makes an offer that says, we're going to extend unemployment benefits out to 99 weeks. Now it makes it harder yet for the private sector to recover, because once they're competing with the government's offer to hire employees away, or the government's offer to pay people not to work. And where does that money come from? This federal government borrows it. This federal government borrows it from the Chinese, borrows it from the Saudis, borrows it from multiple countries around the world, and about 50% of it, to be fair, comes from investors within the United States, domestic funds that are invested into U.S. Treasury bills, for example. So a government that believes that it can stimulate economy by stimulating consumption and completely ignores the part of the equation that requires that there be production and for the economy to function. And I would point out that if no one is producing any food, clothing, or shelter, if no one is producing any transportation links out there in the private sector, if no one is making available any of the recreational facilities that will attract those dollars, there's not production. If there's not production, there's no place for anyone to spend their money. This economy is production-driven, not consumption-driven. And we must, to grow out of this economic situation that we're in, we must produce goods and services that have a marketable value, both domestically and abroad. When we do that, and we will eventually do that, this country will grow out of this problem that we are in. But we must get government off of our back. We must keep a competitive tax rate for the rest of the world. We must reduce our regulation. We must stimulate our entrepreneurs. And this Republican side of the aisle has now for about 3 years been saying, where are the jobs? Mr. President, where are the jobs? Well, I've heard that echo many times in this chamber and across through the media outlets in the country. But I would submit that there's something else out there that's required before there will be any jobs, and that's the prospect of profit. Investors, employers, entrepreneurs must have a prospect for profit before they will invest their money or put their time in or take the risk of hiring employees, especially with ever more regulations, especially with Obamacare pouring down over everything that we do. We are not going to get to a recovery until investors, entrepreneurs, and employers can see an opportunity for profit and begin to realize that profit, because you can't write paychecks for employees from a deficit spending very long. You must have profit in order to pay employees. So if there's going to be jobs and we want Americans to go to work, you must have profit in order to fund the wages. And I don't know why I don't hear that from anybody else. It's as if this word profit is a dirty word. No, it's a very good thing. America is a country that has to build on profit, on free enterprise capitalism. I just took a look in my desk drawer today, There are flashcards in there that were published in 2008. These are the flashcards that enable one to be trained for naturalization here in the United States. So if you want to become an American citizen, you come to America legally, get yourself a green card, and what you do is you have to take the test, and part of that test is what's the economic system? Free enterprise capitalism. That's on the test. It's a little heads up, Mr. President. I hope you could pass that test. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate your attention, and I yield back the balance of my time.